That continues to happen today. Right now in this country, students of color are half as likely to be placed in advanced placement and honors classes compared to white students. Students of color are half as likely to be taught by the most experienced teachers. White students twice as likely to have the most experienced teachers, right? Black and Latino students 2, 3, even 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, even though they do not break the rules more often than white students. That's the belief, but it's not true. There have been 14 different studies. They all find the same thing, that the rates of serious school rule infractions are virtually identical across racial lines. People bringing drugs to campus, equally across racial lines. People bringing weapons to campus, actually white men more likely to bring guns and knives to campus in K-12 schools than black men or Latino men. Contrary to popular belief, but that's what the Centers for Disease Control research says. But who is it that's getting caught? It's black kids and Latino kids. They're the ones getting searched. They're the ones getting detected. They're the ones getting suspended and often prosecuted, whereas white students are doing the same thing, doing drugs just as much, bringing weapons just as often, if not more so, and escaping notice.
Hello, brothers and sisters. I hope you're all doing fine. Now, this speech by Tim Wise, a very renowned professor, activist, and lawyer, is pissing off white racists. And this is the speech that has gone viral because Tim Wise is talking about how white people are conditioned to hate black people with absolutely no reason. Now, he talks about how the systems in the US have been conditioned to oppress black people, that no black person can get justice in courts. No black person can get justice at their workplace. No black person has ever gotten justice when it comes to police brutality. So let's watch this video, then have a very quick discussion at the end of it. Thank you so much.
See, because I know that when the crowds are this big, usually there's been some academic bribery involved. I'm cool with that. I don't really care why you came. Like, I don't care whether you're here because issues of racism or like the stuff that gets you out of bed in the morning and that gets your blood pumping, or whether you're here for the extra credit. Either way, you're here and I'm here, and I keep the lights on very deliberately so that if you get up to leave, I will totally notice and call that shit out. So you might just want to hang out. It's just an hour of your life. You ain't going to get it back again, but it won't be that painful, and it'll hopefully be informative. You're not under any obligation to agree with the things that I say. The only thing you have to do is listen and then commit to thinking about some of the things that I say, and then having this conversation and continuing this dialogue with the folks on this campus who I have no doubt, both faculty, staff, administrators, and students, have been wanting and desiring this conversation and real traction around issues of racial equity for a long time. And those folks are disproportionately people of color to whom we need to learn to listen, and whose lead we need, those of us called white, to follow when it comes to creating racial equity. So on the one hand, I'm very glad to be here as, a aspiring white ally to talk about these issues, but the real work and the real leaders on this subject, whether we're talking about at this or any other campus, or those folks of color who live with issues of race and racism every day, who speak out about them every week, and yet who are often ignored. I hope that the next time there is a program on this campus in which not a white man, but a person of color is above you on this podium speaking, that you will be here just as readily as you are this evening, because only then will we really know that we're making progress as a society. When a person of color can get up and say all of the things that I'm about to say in the next hour and be taken as seriously as I expect to be, and get the amazing applause that I'm totally gonna get when I'm done, because this is gonna be really great. Or now, whatever, that's great too. So here's the thing, the reason I'm really glad you're here, even if it's for the academic bribery piece of the extra credit, is that a lot of times when we have discussions about race on campus, and I've been doing this work for a long time, been doing anti-racism and civil rights work for 25 years, I've been doing it on the lecture circuit for 21 of those, and a lot of times people don't come to these events because they are under the impression, and they have every reason to be, they've been encouraged to think that we don't have to have this conversation anymore, that we've attained some level of post-raciality as a society, and so this conversation is passé, this conversation is tired, we don't have to talk about race, and we know this because having a man of color as president for the last roughly 8 years proves that we can't really have a problem with racism. Of course, if we were to think about that for just a second, and we were to ask if that were true for gender. So if I were to say, for instance, does it mean that there is no sexism in England because Margaret Thatcher was the head of state there? Or if I were to say that there is no patriarchy in Pakistan because a woman, Benazir Bhutto, was elected there not once but twice. Now, she has been assassinated since, so it lets you know how much some folks loved her. But if I were to suggest that there was no sexism, no patriarchy, no rape culture in any of the many nations where women have been heads of state, in Ireland, in Israel, in India, Great Britain, the Philippines, Pakistan, Germany right now, I think every woman in the room at the very least would know that I'd lost my mind. I don't think there are any women in this room who plan on packing your bags and moving to Karachi tomorrow just because Benazir Bhutto was the head of state, because we understand that just because a woman can attain the pinnacle of political leadership doesn't mean that millions of other women do not face sexism. Individual accomplishment doesn't tell us anything in and of itself about systemic, structural, institutional, society-wide truth. But when it comes to race, we apparently believe it does in this country. So the presence of a man of color in the head of political leadership, we are to believe, and we are told, means that we don't have to have this conversation. Or we're told that it's not that we don't have to have it, it's just that having it makes things worse. You'll hear that. People will say, if you would just not talk about racism, racism would go away. It's people like you, meaning people like me, who keep racism alive by insisting on discussing it. Yes, of course, because we all know that social problems are the result of conversations about social problems. We all know that, right? Like if I were going to give a talk about world hunger, I'm sure you would all agree that I probably shouldn't do that, because if I open my mouth and tell you that there are billions of children on this planet starving from lack of nutrition, that I probably ought not say it, because if I say it, that's why they will starve. Right? And if I would just be quiet, if I would just be silent, that somehow food would miraculously appear on their plates. To blame the conversation for the problem is like blaming your speedometer for your speeding ticket. Right? The speedometer didn't cause you to go 80 in a 65. All it did was tell you what you've done, right? It's just a way of transmitting information. That's all that a conversation about race is. It can't be blamed for the problem of racism. There wouldn't be a need for the conversation were the problem of racism not in existence. The same is true with any other social problem. So we have to move past this idea that the more we talk about it, the worse it gets, because there's no other problem about which we would say that with a straight face. Now, having said that, I don't want to suggest that any conversation will do. Just because we have to have a discussion about these issues doesn't mean that it's irrelevant how we talk about it. There are better and worse ways of addressing the issue of race and racism. And I want to suggest to you that by and large, our problem stems, I think, from three large issues or barriers to effective dialogue, things that keep us from having the kind of discussion that we really need to have. Maybe four if I have time, but three for sure. The first is that, for the most part, we steadfastly refuse to accept that we ourselves harbor racial bias. In other words, we take this view that we have attained this pinnacle of colorblindness, that we do not see or think about race, that yes, there may be other people out there who are racist, but not me. My Uncle Jim, he's an asshole, but not me, you see. I don't have any of that bias. I have black friends. I dated an Asian woman once. I have a dream catcher in my rear view mirror, and now I have come to the conclusion that my great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess. I can't possibly have any racism in me. That's somebody else's problem, not mine. So our inability to see ourselves as racially biased makes it very difficult to have an honest conversation, because we spend so much time trying to divide ourselves into the good people who are not racist and the bad people who are racist, that we miss the fact that we're all being programmed and conditioned in racist ways every day. So I'll have more to say about that in a second. But the second problem that keeps us from having real dialogue and making progress and taking action after the dialogue is that even when we are willing to acknowledge personal bias, we don't see the systemic problem. So we might be willing to attack the individual racist who does something on a college campus. We might be willing, for instance, to punish the women on the softball team here at Stetson in 2005 who did whatever it was they did. I've forgotten now what had happened, but we can punish them, we can make them read my book, we could theoretically kick them off campus, we could do whatever, right? But that doesn't necessarily get at the systemic and the institutional, the structural problem. So I want us to talk about the difference, right, between the individual and personal on the one hand and the structural and the institutional on the other. So we'll talk more about that. The third thing, and this is big, and I'll spend the bulk of my time on this, is that we refuse to acknowledge the way that history affects where we are today. The way that the past affects the present. We have this incredibly ahistorical view, right? That the past is the past and it doesn't matter. The present is now, the future is then. It's a very linear thing, right? What happens in one generation apparently doesn't affect the next in our mind, and we don't want to talk about the history of racism in our country, even though unless you understand that history, you cannot understand anything that you see today with regard to racial disparities in this country. It is impossible to understand everything from where people live and where they don't unless you understand that history. It is impossible to understand disparities in wealth or income or educational outcomes unless you understand that history. It is absolutely impossible to understand why police are 21 times more likely to kill young black men than young white men, 2 to 3 times more likely to do so even when those men are unarmed, unless you understand the history of law enforcement, policing, and how we got to this space. It is impossible to understand the current drama concerning the issue of immigration unless you understand our history, and particularly how we have misremembered it. It isn't just a matter of how the past affects the present, it's how we remember the past or misremember it also affects the present. And I'll have a lot to say about that. And if I have time, there will be one more, but I won't tell you what it is yet because I may not have time, and we may just have to save that for a different day. So let's talk about these one at a time. First, the individual piece, right? This idea that, yes, there's racism, but not me. I, as the saying goes, don't have a racist bone in my body as I have all those black friends. This is something that African American folk are intimately familiar with, this line that we as white folks use. Oh, I've got black friends, so I can't possibly be racist. First of all, usually, let's just be honest, when we say we have black friends, we are usually lying. I'm just wanting to be honest and truthfully. I'm not saying that sometimes we're not telling the truth, but most of the time we're not. How do I know that? Very simple, because a few years ago there was a survey that was taken where they found that 75% of white Americans, which that year was 142 million white people, said that we had many black friends. Now I want you to think about that. When you say many, you just told me what you meant. See, I know what many means. If you wanted to tell me that you had one black friend, which I might have believed, you would have said a, not many. If you wanted to tell me that you had 2 black friends, which, all right, maybe, you would have said a couple, not many. If you wanted to tell me you had 3 black friends, which now I'm really starting to think you might be lying, you would have said a few. So when you say you have many, you just said you had 4 or more black friends each. Keep in mind the numbers, 142 million white people who said that they had 4 or more black friends each, and there were only 35 million black people to go around that year. Half of whom said they didn't even have one white friend. So actually, there weren't even 35 million black folk for us to hang out with and play with and party with. It was like 17.5 million black people to go around for 142 million white people. I wasn't good at math, but I'm seeing a problem between the numerator and the denominator, as the saying goes, right? I'm not saying that we might not be friendly with people of color, but there's a difference between being friendly, talking to folks in the res hall, talking to folks when you see them on campus or around the water cooler at work, and actually being friends. But more importantly, even if every one of us was telling the truth, it wouldn't matter, would it? What does having friends of color have to do with whether or not you might be racially biased? See, we act like somehow that's a get out of jail free card, that we can't be racist if we have black friends. Think about the logic of that. If that were true, then heterosexual straight men could never be sexist, because our ultimate defense would be what? I love women. I date women. I married me a woman. I can't be sexist. I sleep with women. How can I be sexist? The only sexist men are gay men by that logic, which makes no damn sense at all. Right? And we would recognize the idea that the women in this room think that they're like no sexist heterosexual men. I doubt that any of you would nod in agreement with that, but that's sort of the logical analogy from some of my best friends are black or Latino, or I dated an Asian woman or whatever. None of that matters, right? It sort of misses the point that one can have personal bias even if one has personal closeness to people from a different group, because what you can do is carve out an exception for those handful that you like and still hold on to biases about the larger group. There was actually a survey that was done right before the 2008 presidential election where it was found that something like 40% of white Democrats, right, when they were polled, said, yeah, they were going to vote for President Obama. There were 40% who said, yes, they were going to vote for him, but that they still held on to very serious racial stereotypes about the larger black community. So they had created an exception, for Barack Obama, but the way that they viewed the larger community of black folks was still negative. So is that racism or not? I would say it's a 2.0 version, 3.0 version, but it's still a form of bias. So the idea that we're not personally biased just because of our connection to people of color doesn't really wash. But more importantly, we know from the research that it just isn't true, right? That in fact, the overwhelming majority of us have been conditioned to harbor racial biases, and as a result, we do so. The overwhelming data suggests that most all of us have, to some extent or another, internalized certain negative stereotypical biases against black folks, against Latino folk, against Muslims in a post-9/11 environment, against poor people of all races and ethnicities, against women as women, regardless of class or race, against LGBTQ folks, against disabled people, right? Any time that a group is marginalized, there comes certain stigmas and stereotypes, and we're all familiar with them. And not only are we familiar with them, the research says overwhelmingly we actually have internalized them. In fact, the research says that about 45% of black folks, nearly half, have actually internalized negative biases against other black folks. So it isn't just white folks who get conditioned. Even the one who's the target of the stereotype is vulnerable to internalizing it. So there was this study a few years back, just to give you an example of what I mean, where they took these nice white liberal people who didn't have any overt racism so far as anybody could tell, and they hooked them up in a lab setting to these brain scan monitoring machines, right? So they put the electrodes on the head and they're monitoring the brain scan images, right? And they start to flash images on a computer screen in front of the subjects who are taking this test. Keep in mind, none of these people are overt racists. None of them are Klansmen. They're not white supremacists or skinheads, right? They're sitting in front of a screen and they're being shown images. And the images are being flashed so quickly that their brain can't even consciously know what it saw, right? So it's like 85 milliseconds or something. This is stuff that they used to do back in the 50s in movie theaters. They would actually do this, right? They would put these subliminal messages on the screen. They'd go into the film and they'd insert the word popcorn on the film, right? So you're sitting there watching the film and all of a sudden you're like, damn, I need some popcorn. You don't even know where that came from. It's a subliminal message. They just flash it really quick. Your conscious mind doesn't know. They stopped doing that in the movies, I think, right? But how would I know? I have no idea. Maybe they're still doing it. I don't know. But what I do know is that in this particular case, they're flashing these images for 85 milliseconds, and most of the images were sort of meaningless, like a beach ball, a bunny rabbit, a blade of grass, a tree, whatever. And there wasn't a whole lot of activity on the brain scan, right? Not a lot was going on. But then they flashed an image of a black male face for 85 milliseconds. Once again, your conscious brain doesn't even know what it saw or that it even saw anything, but subconsciously your brain is responding. What happened? Well, that part of the brain that responds to anxiety and fear lit up like a Christmas tree, right? That part that tries to regulate after you're afraid of something, it's called executive function. So when you have an irrational response that you're trying to control, it lights up because you're trying to get a control of your emotions. The point being, you only had to get control of your emotions because there was some kind of a fear response in the first place, and this was among nice white liberal people without any overt racism at all. What does it mean that even people with no overt bias could still have a type of subconscious priming that allows them to respond that way? And that was in a nice, comfortable lab, man. They're sitting there with bottles of water and air conditioning, sitting in a nice, cushy chair. What do you think that might imply for law enforcement on the street when they encounter folks of color in situations that are not nearly that comfortable and that easy? What might it mean for a teacher in a classroom when they're interacting with students in a situation that might be stressful and how they respond to that child? See, what this tells us is that we can be conditioned to have these responses even though we don't even know we have them, right? Because why? Advertising works. Advertising works. What do I mean by that? Think about a couple of weeks ago, Super Bowl, right? These companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars to sell you a bunch of stuff, right? So they're trying to sell you Sprint plan. They're trying to sell you certain types of toilet paper, toothpaste, beer, Diet Coke, whatever the hell Drake was trying to sell, right? We're selling you all this stuff, and these companies spend like $100 million. I think that was the Sprint ad, was Drake, right? $100 million or more to try to take out these ads and sell you consumer products. Why? Because they understand that the more you see their ad, the better odds are that you will buy their junk, right? And that happens. We know actually in the world of marketing, there is a theory called the rule of 12, right? And what the rule of 12 says is that when you've seen an ad a dozen times, that's the moment where you're exponentially more likely to go buy the product, right? So like the first couple times you see it, you're like, sometimes if you're like me, you look at the ad, you're like, what the hell was that? I don't even know what that was an ad for. Like, these people are stupid. I'm not gonna buy there. I don't even know what the hell it was. These people are idiots. Oh, you think they're idiots? They just spent millions of dollars. You think they're just throwing money away? No, they know what they're doing. They give you a vague, innocuous ad the first few times, because then you'll be the fifth time, sixth time, you'll be like, I gotta pay attention to that shit. That was crazy the first 4 times. Now all of a sudden you're looking at it, you're like, oh, Taco Bell Crunch Wrap. Breakfast Crunch Wrap, right? And at first you're still like, that's ridiculous. Why would I want a taco wrapped up like a burrito with the egg and a piece of sausage in it at 6 o'clock in the damn morning? Why do I need that? Nobody ever wanted that. Reverse the clock 5 years before they had that. You think anybody was lobbying for a breakfast crunch wrap at 6 in the morning? Any of y'all write a letter to Taco Bell like, you know what we need at 6 a.m. is a taco wrapped up like a burrito with the egg and a piece of sausage in it. Nobody was asking for that, but some genius at Taco Bell was like, watch this. And he creates the product, or she does. They create an ad campaign for it. Now you got folks around the block. They're like, I'm not eating Egg McMuffins anymore. Screw Egg McMuffins. I'm all about a breakfast crunch wrap. And they sold you on it because you saw the ad 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, and then folks started trying it. Now, if that can work with Taco Bell, it can work with toilet paper, toothpaste, tennis shoes, cell phones, candy, right? Think about how much easier it is to sell you on a racial stereotype, because you've seen that ad, metaphorically speaking, more than just 12 times, right? We've been exposed to those stereotypes way more than 12 times by the time we're young adults. We've been exposed to that stuff all of our lives, and it takes root in us whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And if we don't acknowledge it, see, it's very hard for us to move forward because we're so busy saying, you're a racist, but I'm not. You're prejudiced, but I'm not. You've got bias, but I don't, that we can't even see ourselves in the work. But let me tell you something. This thing can affect everyone, even no matter how progressive you think you are, no matter what kind of progressive home that you were raised in. And I know this from personal experience because I've seen it in my own children. My wife and I have 2 daughters. They're 14 and 12. But when they were 7 and 5, one Sunday afternoon, we're sitting around, and it's raining out, right? Can't really go to the park. So we're looking for a TV, looking for a movie to watch on the cable satellite deal or whatever, right? So we're flipping around the on-demand Comcast thing and looking at trailers, looking at commercials for different movies. And we come across the trailer for the movie Evan Almighty. If y'all remember that, it was comedy where Steve Carell plays a congressman and Morgan Freeman plays God, and Morgan Freeman tells Steve Carell that a big flood is coming and he should build an ark like Noah and ride it out. You know, it's sort of cute. It's like the modern retelling of the Noah and the ark story, I guess. You know? And as it turns out, my wife and 2 daughters had already seen the film at the theater, so they didn't necessarily want to watch it again that Sunday, but because they had seen it, they recognized the actors on the trailer, and they recognized some of the dialogue, right? So it got their attention. And the youngest of my daughters at that time, Rachel, right? She's 5 years old. She looks up and she does what any 5-year-old would do. She says, Daddy, is that God? Pointing at Morgan Freeman, right? In the flowing white robes in the role of God. And I thought that was sort of cute because that's exactly what you would say at 5, right? I mean, like when you're 5, you don't know anything about the Screen Actors Guild or like casting directors, right? You just figure maybe God wanted to make a movie. And if God wanted to make a movie, odds are God could get the movie made. Like it wouldn't be hard for God. Now, one would hope that he would make a movie that, got better than 23% on Rotten Tomatoes, but at least in theory, this could get done. So my 5-year-old asked the question. I sort of laugh at it. I'm like, no, Rachel, no, that's not God. That's just an actor. That's Morgan Freeman. He plays God. Often he'll probably be in this role again. He sort of gets it over and over and over. But it's just an actor playing a part. And she's like, oh, okay, good, cool. And I thought the conversation was over with, right? But it wasn't, because then the 7-year-old, Ashton, looks up. Now she's interested in this conversation. She looks up, she sees Morgan Freeman in the role of God, looks at her sister, starts to laugh, and she goes, "Rachel, that can't be God." And I knew in that moment two things, as surely as I knew my own name, right? One was that I was gonna have to ask her why not. And secondly, I already knew what her answer was gonna be before I ever asked her the question. But I knew I had to ask it. Now I was hoping for some help from my wife. So I looked to the left where she was sitting, and I got nothing at all, except the look that was like, "Yeah, smartass, this would be your area of expertise. I really got nothing for you. I might take some pictures and scrapbook this precious moment, but beyond that, I got nothing." So I knew it was on me. I looked back at my daughter and I asked her the question. I said, "Why? Why can't that be God?" And in the moment before she answered, I had this fantasy, this really brief like blip of a fantasy in my brain where she was gonna give me a really great answer. Not the one I'm expecting, but one that I'm hoping for, like, "Well, Daddy, that can't be God because God is a woman." That would have been cool. That's not what she says. I'm also thinking maybe she'll say something like really deep and philosophical, like some existentialist answer like, "Oh, Father, what is God anyway?" But she was 7, so she didn't give me that. Instead, she gives me exactly what I knew she would. She says, "That can't be God because God isn't black, God is white." Now, please know this, and it probably won't surprise you to learn if you didn't already know, we don't have any racialized images of a deity in our home. We don't have any images of a deity at all in our home, but certainly no racialized images of a God, right? We never allowed those awful, one might say god-awful if one was intended to giving puns, and right, those god-awful children's Bible books that permeate the South. If you're from the South like I am, they have them in every damn pediatrician's office, right? The blue books, the Bible series, because that's what you need when you get your booster shot is a little God talk. That's really important, So they have these god-awful blue children's Bible stories, the ones that make Adam and Eve look like they were in the Garden of Sweden, right? Right, Adam looks like Justin Bieber. I mean like old school with the bob Justin Bieber, not like ripped and tattooed Justin Bieber. I mean like old school Justin Bieber. It's absurd, right? The idea that the first human beings look like that, right? Obviously absurd. There's God right in the clouds, Santa in the sky, white dude. All the biblical characters in the Bible, children's books, white people, even though they were in a part of the world where there are no white people, right? So even though we don't have that in our home, my child has nonetheless already at the age of 7 somehow internalized the idea that the creation source of the universe, whether taken in religious terms or humanistic and more naturalistic terms, is somehow closer to her than to Morgan Freeman. And if my daughter has internalized that, what do you think black and brown children internalize when they see the same imagery? And they see those images. They see them in the stained glass of our churches. You see them in the Christmas cards that get sent around every holiday season where baby Jesus is in the manger in what apparently is Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, rather than the other Bethlehem. Right? Lily white Jesus, which makes no sense anthropologically, biologically, historically, makes no sense at all. But our children see those images and it can affect them. Now, if you were to try to break into my house and hurt my children, I would kill you. Without hesitation. I don't even have a gun, but I would find something and I would throw it at you and you would die. Like, it's just that simple. I would make sure that you died, right? If you were to try to hurt my kids. I'm not saying that because I'm a badass. I'm just saying I'm just letting you know, don't mess with my children. But the problem, right? The problem is that there is something coming into that house. And it is hurting my children, and it's hurting all of our children, and it's hurting us, and I didn't even know it was there. See, the doors are locked at night, the windows are shut, the alarm is on, and whatever this thing is doesn't know the code, but the dirty little secret is it doesn't need to. It weasels its way into our children's brains and affects them. That's how I know that we've all ingested this poison, and we better own that if we're gonna have an honest dialogue. It's not about feeling guilty about it. In fact, that's the beauty of it, right? If we've all been subjected to it, there's no reason to feel guilty, because we could not have helped but ingest it. The question is, what do we do now? How do we take responsibility, which is not the same as guilt? Responsibility is what you take because of the kind of person you are. Guilt is what you feel for the stuff you've actually done. Those are two different things. We take responsibility for things even when we're not to blame for them. So that's the first piece. The second piece, the systemic piece, right? Our inability or our lack of willingness to admit that there's also a systemic element to racism, that it's not just about personal prejudice. If it were, it'd be so much easier, right? because we could just educate people out of their biases, right? And we could somehow undo their personal stuff and everything would be fine. But there's a bigger problem, and it's systemic. It's the way that policies and practices and everyday procedures reinforce inequality between different racial groups, even if there's no overt bigotry in the room. What do I mean?
Hello, brothers and sisters. Now, the history of injustices that were committed against black people in the United States and Western countries started long ago and are very complex and deeply rooted in these countries' history. Now, there is need for us to talk about the social, economic, and political systems that were placed and conditioned to oppress black people. Now, Tim Wise is a very renowned lawyer and an activist who has been talking about the injustices that were committed against black people without compensation. He has been talking about how white people have been conditioned to hate the black folks without even very valid reasons. Now, we all know that all this started with slavery, which began in 1619 and later on to 1865. Which these are just figures. I feel like slavery has never stopped. That they talk about the end of slavery, which happened 1865. But when you go to countries in Europe and see the jobs that black people have been conditioned to do and how they have been conditioned to live, then you must in your brain know that this has never ended, that we black people still have a long way to go. Now, I just want to talk about whatever Tim Wise has been talking about and whatever he addresses in this video. I know this video is going to piss a lot of racist people and those people who were conditioned to hate black people or black folks for absolutely no reason. Now, it's the slavery that led to all this that we are seeing. It is the slavery that led to these problems that most black people have in the US and in the Western countries. Now, in the beginning of 1619, millions of Africans were sold, others kidnapped, and others were taken forcibly to those sites in the US and in the Western countries. Now, it must be remembered that black people at that time were treated as property and denied very basic human rights like rights to life and freedom to speech and so many other things. And this subjected them to brutal conditions on plantations, in households, and throughout the nation. Now, you must also remember that even after black people were taken from Africa, they were ripped off of their culture. They were ripped off of their freedoms and rights. Then they were even denied to associate. Now, this actually made it hard for the black folks to survive. And these conditions were made that after the black folks worked and finished, maybe after achieving whatever they wanted them to do for them, that black folks were to be wiped away, to be wiped out. But it is to their surprise that it never worked. And they were conditioned to hate black people. They were conditioned to put black people in an environment where they won't survive anymore. But we are really, really grateful that great things happened to black people. Black people went ahead, fought these injustices, adapted to these environments, and later on started succeeding in this Babylon. Now, this did not sit well with most of these oppressors. You all remember the Jim Crow laws, which were put there to actually oppress and support slavery. This is because they had seen black people starting to shine, black people starting to find a life in this very cruel land, and they were in the Black Code. You can remember the Black Code that happened in 1865 and 1866, and it was after the Civil War in the southern states, which enacted very strict laws to make sure that anyone or any newborn black baby didn't have any rights in their lands, that you had no right to life. Your life could be taken at any time without question. You are to work without asking for payments or wages. You are to do everything as instructed by your master without questioning. And questioning was regarded as a death sentence. Now, these things happening and going back and going forward in 1877, you must remember, and 1965, the Jim Crow laws that people like Martin Luther King were fighting all their lives, and people like Malcolm X were fighting all their lives. These were laws that were enacted and put there to make sure that no black person did have any right to anything. That these state and local laws enforced racial segregation, and these which kept black people and white people separated in schools, transportation, public facilities, and more. And you must remember, these laws, the Jim Crow laws, were actually white supremacist laws that were actually meant to bring the supreme being of white people, that they were going to rule over black people. So when we talk, and when Tim Wise is talking about all these things, we black people must have at the back of our mind, we must have a clear history of where we are from and where we are going to. That we are starting to like the oppressor just because the oppressor has been coming out to ask for apologies and all this and making some confessions. But the fact is, have they refrained from these laws? How the way they were conditioned, are they changing, or did they change? You must actually remember how the sharecropping and economic exploitation of black people happened. That black people were being paid little money for having worked for long hours, and following slavery, and many black people became sharecroppers, and the system where worked land owned by white people exchanged for a portion for the crop. Now, many white people oppressed black people after working for them for long hours, after working for them for years and days, that all they could pay you with a portion of a crop. That after working for their big farm, they divide a portion at the end of that farm. Then they will give you a 50 by 100 where you can cultivate your crops after having worked for them for years and all this stuff. These things were meant to affect black people. These things were meant to actually oppress black people and make them look stupid in a way. And black people in the late 18 and early 90s, black people started opening up their eyes and their brain. They started thinking so wisely. And that was the rise of a black man in the foreign land. That was the rise of black. You must remember the Renaissance period, and you must remember how the Renaissance period played a key and very significant role in making sure that the right of black people really mattered at that time. Because the Renaissance, you must remember the jazz music started long back in the Renaissance period. Now, this music was actually played to, one, emulate the culture of black people, two, actually speak about the oppression that black people were going through in this land. Three, this the jazz music was just to communicate to black people to come together and speak as one people. Now, you remember at one point, jazz music was almost being banned in most of these countries, and they said it was racist in a way, that jazz music was racist in a way. But they were talking with a lot of sarcasm, because if someone is being oppressed and he tries to talk about the oppression in an art, then they ban that art, because they say that that art is a part of segregation and it is dividing people the more. But in real sense, black people have come from far, brothers and sisters. And if there is a lot of history that I can say, that I can remember reading from books and others studying in the campus, there is a lot that can be said. But this is my request to all black folks, that we need to speak for ourselves, that we need to enact some laws for ourselves, and make sure that we follow all these things that we say, that the black unity is very inevitable, that no one is going to stop it. It is us who are not uniting. If we unite, the Babylon will fall, and the Babylon is falling not far from now. So we have had a lot. Black people in the diaspora have suffered a lot, and they have had a lot of challenges. So when Tim Wise is speaking about this, I know most racist, white, and supremacists are being offended by his speeches. And this is the time that we had the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s that were being led by the likes of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and they were later on assassinated. So there is need for us to start talking as black people. The racial discrimination in education and in employment must come to a stop. These are not just historical injustices. Yes, there is historical injustices, but they keep on happening to this time. The cultural and social exclusion that we couldn't practice our own culture. The brothers in the diaspora were ripped off their culture, their religion, their rights. So they were socially excluded in a way, because you can't socialize and get to know each other, get to interact with their own culture. So there is a lot that the representation and stereotypes did to our people. And you can also remember the housing discrimination and the wealth gap that has existed for the longest, because black people are conditioned to be poor. And you can also remember the Black Movement Matter that started way back in 2013 till now. It still goes on and on. So there is need for us to talk about the police brutality and the state sanctioned violence that is ongoing against black folks around the world. So it is a lot, and the mass incarceration of black individuals, people being arrested, not well charged, and taken to court, and where they do not even get justice or get good attorney who can maybe talk for them. It's just a lot. So thank you so much for having taken your time to watch this video. I appreciate so much, brothers and sisters. There is much that we can talk as black folks. There is much when we sit together and have a discussion. We might come together and unite and fight this oppression. Thank you so much. May you have a good time.